What do we do when we get an unexpected phone call informing us that a dear person is no more? Welcome to Mindscape Matters, a channel to discuss mental health and more. I am Dr. Mohan Raj, a consultant psychiatrist based in Chennai, and I'll be with you as we discussed about various facets of mental health. Today, let's discuss about grief. Today's discussion will have references to death and dying. And if you are sensitive to the topic of death, you may want to avoid this episode. Grief is another normal form of sadness. Grief is an emotion that we experience when we lose a loved one, usually due to death. It's a normal response to loss. The features of grief are very similar to depression: intense sadness, decreased interest, decreased enjoyment, but all in the context of the loss of a loved person. There is also loss of appetite and sleep. Crying is also common in grief. It could vary from some people barely tearing up, with tears rolling out, or bouts of crying. Some cultures like ours have a form of music called oppari, which is a music for mourning and grief, and would induce crying in the participants. In addition, in grief, the grieving person would have constant thoughts about the departed person. They'll be longing to see them just one more time, or a wish they might enter the room just like they have always done. Sometimes the person feels they heard the departed person calling their name. At other times, people report that they could see the departed person sitting in their usual chair and gesturing towards them. They also realize that it's not true. The above two experiences are illusions, which result from memory of the person and a longing wish to see them again. Some people would have dreams about conversing with the departed person. Each one of us grieves differently. There are multiple factors that determine how we grieve. It depends on who passed away and what was their age, and also the age of the person who is left behind. For example, if a person who died is a spouse or a romantic partner, the grief is intense. This is because the person had found a special someone to spend the rest of their life. They think, this is the person I'm going to spend the rest of their life with, and suddenly that person is no more. Here the grief is likely to be very intense. If the person who died is a parent, the type of grief depends on whether the parents were aged, say 80 to 90 plus years, and have lived a good life. Death of a parent after 80 or 90 is easier to take, as the son or daughter have a sense of satisfaction that the parent has had lived a full life. If the parents died younger, the impact can be much more. Grief also depends on the age of the children left behind. If the son or daughter who is grieving is 50 to 60 years old when the parents die, the grief is going to be a lot different than, say, if the son or daughter is 20 or 30. If the griever who is left behind is a child or a teenager, the loss of parent can have a significant impact and the grief is likely to be severe. This is because the child or adolescent is still dependent on the parent for emotional and physical need and has not become an independent thinking individual. The grief for a departed grandparent, uncle, aunt, a sibling or a friend depends upon the interpersonal relationship the person has had with the departed person. If the person who passed away is a child and the grieving person is a parent, the grief is going to be immense, irrespective of the age of the person who is grieving. They would also have the thought that God or nature has been unfair in snatching away the life of an youngster while older people are still around. Another factor that can influence grief is the nature of the death. Is the death due to old age, or an illness? Was it a sudden death due to a tragic accident? Or was it a suicide? A death due to an accident or suicide would cause much more grief than death due to old age or natural causes. Many researchers have studied grief and have tried to understand the process. As we discuss, each one of us grieves differently, and so the process is bound to be different for each one of us. But there are certain commonalities, and let us look at some of them. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a Swiss-American psychiatrist, wrote about 5 stages of grief in her book on death and dying, written in 1969. In that book, she had actually written about how a person with terminal illness deals with their own death. But later, the 5-stage model is also used to understand grief for losing someone dear. Kubler-Ross model mentions the 5 stages as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Let's look at all of them. All people don't necessarily go through these stages and not necessarily in that order. Let's look at these stages. The first stage is denial. We get a phone call with the terrible news that someone dear to us is no more. Our first response is denial. It's impossible. I saw him today this morning. He was full of life. He spoke very well, is our usual response. It's unlikely to be him. They probably mixed up the names. Maybe he was not in that plane, or maybe he was not in that train. They'll come back to say that they made a mistake and that he is safe. Or he himself will call to clarify things that it was a goof up. Our mind does not accept that a loved one is no more. There is some solace in thinking that the news could be wrong, could be a mistake. The period of denial gives us some time to slowly process the information and understand that death actually happened to someone dear to us. The next stage is anger. The anger can be directed against anyone. The anger can be directed against self for not helping the departed person enough. I should have taken them for treatment at least few days earlier, and that could have saved them. Or the anger could be against the treating medical team. They didn't treat properly, that's why the person died. Or if the death was due to an accident, the anger could be against the government for the road infrastructure. Or the anger could be against God. How can God be so unfair? I've been a devotee for 40 years and this is what God gives me in return, is what they might say. Or the anger could turn against the person who departed. How could he just die leaving me alone, is what people could say. The next stage is bargaining. In their head, the grieving person constantly is reenacting scenarios that would have avoided death. If only I had taken my mother for annual cancer screening, instead of once in 2 years, we could have diagnosed the cancer earlier and she might be alive now. Or if only I had come 1 hour earlier, I could have taken him out to the shop. He wouldn't have gone out on a 2-wheeler and met with an accident. There are a lot of could have, should have statements in the person's mind, and this leads to guilt. Guilt can complicate normal grief. The next stage is depression. The person feels the pain of the loss. There is depressed mood, decreased interest in everything, the ability to enjoy comes down, the person's sleep and appetite are disturbed, the person feels there is no point in continuing to live without the presence of the loved one. This is entirely normal grief response. The final stage is acceptance. The person accepts what has happened and understands that life is not permanent, and in fact nothing or no one is permanent. The person also realizes and accepts that without the loved one is gone, I have their memories and thoughts, and they'll continue to live in the wonderful memories we have made together. Acceptance gives a lot of pain, but it's also the beginning of the healing process. Grief is not related to only death of somebody close to us. We can experience grief even when we lose somebody to a divorce or separation. Sometimes we talk about grief about losing a job or moving away from one town to another. Sometimes we grieve a lifestyle. More of that later. In the next episode, let's look at the factors that can prolong or complicate the normal grief process. Thank you for staying this long. If you like this video, tell 4 of your friends. Tell them there is a Tamil version also. Stay tuned because Mindscape matters. Bye.